So it's always an honor for me to worship here, and it's a double honor to be able to teach a class on the Reformation in this historic church. I thought maybe what I'll do is give you a little background on myself, both in geography and religion. And because especially religion has a lot to do with this class. So geography-wise, despite my Milwaukee, Wisconsin accent, I was actually born in the heart of Dixie. I was born at Camp Gordon in an Army birth, in the hospital there that no longer exists. My dad was there in the early 50s. My mother actually lived across the Savannah River in North Augusta, South Carolina, at Lookaway Hall. I don't know if anybody knows what that is. The most famous house that overlooks the Savannah River into Augusta. The problem is with us, the footnote on that is she didn't live in the front, she lived in the back in rented apartment servants' quarters. But I have on my birth certificate Lookaway Hall, Forest Avenue. So I've got my, I didn't know, I always thought my Aiken County birth was a novelty when I was growing up in Wisconsin. Then I found out that was divine providence when I moved down to the South. So really, when I come here, I'm a South Carolinian. It was only 3 weeks, but I was here. Okay, so what we want to do, I've got a particular reformer in the church that I wanted to go through and do a little bit as important history. I actually wanted to, when Kevin mentioned the class, I wanted to do 3 of them. That was too much for the time I have. Then I wanted to do 2. Then I actually got into his history, and then I can only really do 1. But let me ask, if it's okay, ask the class some questions here. I got to find out where the class is at on Reformation history. So I got 3 questions. The first one's an easy one. Who's the founder of the German Protestant faith? Okay, right. You all get A's for that one. Who's the founder of the Reformed faith? Reformed Protestant faith. Who said Calvin? Right there. It's a good answer. Anybody else? Any others? Are we all pretty much a consensus on Calvin? I see a lot of nods. All right. Since we're going back to high school and we're grading on a curve, I'm going to give you a C+, but that answer is incorrect. Okay? And it's incorrect by 17 and a half years, and we'll get into that, somehow during the teaching. Okay, let me give you another question. Who is responsible for the Reformation of Geneva, where the magistrates in 1536 declared for the Reformed faith? Okay, Farel, William Farel, right? That's a good answer. Anybody else? All right, you're not going to do Calvin, right? Because I'm going to probably ding you on that one. So the correct answer is Farel first, then Pierre Viret, who we did a biography on, and then the third one would be an obscure teacher that Farel trained. None of them were really ordained. Was Antoine Fermot, who was very responsible for starting the class in Geneva, 1532, 1533. So it was those 3 reformers. Calvin came later, after the Reformation and all the heavy lifting was done. So you get an A over there for that one, Farel. Okay, so before we get into, I have a disclaimer. I am not I'm not an historian. I'm not a scholar on the Reformation. To be such, you've got to know 2.5 languages. You have to know French, you have to know German, and half English. So I'm very good on the half English. And the frustration that I have with the reformer that I want to do today, and the reformer, the founder, let me say this, the founder of the Reformed Church is Ulrich Zwingli. Okay? So he was 17 and a half years before Calvin showed up at Geneva. The frustration I had with Zwingli is I've got all the dozen books in English on Zwingli, and the better works are in German by the Zerkers. And so I can't read German. So we're going to do a survey, an overview. Okay. Another question. Anybody know what that means on a European license plate? Who said that? Have you been to Switzerland? Ah, okay, that's why you know. So what she said was CH stands for Confederation of Helvetia. So Helvetia is the first people that settled ancient Switzerland. And there's a statue in Geneva of a Helvetian statue. So The legal name is Confederation of Helvetia. What's interesting is that if you go to Switzerland, you can use the word confederation, confederate. The Confederates got together. So you can't use it here anymore, right? I guess that's illegal. But in Switzerland, you can use it all that you want. So, all right. So it would be good for me for this understanding of Zwingli is to go over the whole canton system in Switzerland. So you have today you have 26 cantons. The first cantons were, I think, 1291. We call the forest cantons of Schweiz, Lucerne, and Unterwalden. And those confederated in 1291, and then over the years, the confederation grew. I think 1396, Zurich joined. So, and Geneva joined very late. See on the bottom left? So now we have 26. So here's how Switzerland works. It's interesting. When I visit Switzerland, I don't go to all the what is it? The American sites, the ski hills and all that, Lucerne, Davos, and what's the other one? Zermatt or something. I just go to all the Reformation cities. So on the far left, you have the three, but now it's four French-speaking cantons of Vaud, which is Lausanne. Then you have Geneva. Then up there is Neuchâtel, and then Jura broke off from Basel, and that's all French-speaking. Okay, so Calvin obviously was in Geneva. Fribourg, there between Bern and Vaud, is both German-speaking and French-speaking. Fribourg would be both a little Catholic and a little Protestant. Then at the very bottom over here is Ticino, which is actually a Catholic. I mean, it's an Italian canton, so they speak Italian there. So there's 4 languages in Switzerland. The other 2 would be this far right one. I can't pronounce it, but in French it's called Grisons. They would have speak the old language of Romansh, I think is what it's called. It's an old historic antique language in antiquity. But the bulk of Switzerland is going to be all German-speaking. So from Freiburg and Bern on, up to Thurgau, Schaffhausen at the top, St. Gallen, all of that, that's all German-speaking. And that's the areas we're going to discuss today, is more so in the German area, especially Zurich, because that's where Zwingli took the pastorate. The other thing on my background that is important for the class is on my father's side, my grandfather came from Austria, so he was Lutheran, and my grandparents on my mother's side were Italiano. So obviously I was raised in the Roman Church. So any former Catholics here? Oh, okay. You'll love this, my little story here, and I'll try and do it quick. So I was a dutiful Catholic. At 18, my buddy and I, after a Milwaukee Brewer game, strolled into a coffee house on the east side of Milwaukee, and the title of the placard was Jesus Christ Powerhouse. So it was correctly named because there was power inside the house. And so picture 2 Catholic boys going into their first evangelical meeting. So you got these kids coming. This is 1971 now. So this is the Jesus movement. Remember? Any of you old enough to remember that movement? And so we go in there, and then they start bringing these kids up front, testifying how Jesus Christ transformed their life. It's like, we don't have that in the Catholic Church. You know, this was new. And then the band played, and the minister got up, who was just like 27, and he gave a basic gospel message that you can't earn heaven by works or merit, which is what we were into, but by grace through the death and burial and the belief in the propitiation of Christ that's effectual to you as a believer. So he did a real good job there. So there's a call for repentance. We acknowledged the call. We went there the next night, Saturday night. Sunday morning after services, they had services, so I skipped Mass for the first time. I'm 18. And actually, we had to get permission from the priest to go to a non-Catholic service, but I skipped that. So afterwards, they said, we are going to, all these that got saved this weekend, we're going to baptize you. We're going to take down Lake Michigan and baptize you. So who wants to get baptized? So my buddy and I looked at each other. I think that's what we do next. So they took us, then they took us to the prayer room. They said, all you that are going to get baptized, go in the prayer room. So you have to think of late 60s, early 70s. Usually a prayer room has a door. We had beads. Remember beads on the door? You just go through the beads. So a young guy was there. He couldn't have been 20. and he read us the riot act. I mean, he said, when we take you out to Bradford Beach and we baptize you, you are declaring before God and the whole world that you will follow Jesus Christ the rest of your life. And I got it. He said, do you guys get that? Yeah, I got it. And so the baptism for a German boy was somewhat emotional for me. Afterwards, they took us to the men's commune, and, they had separate men and women, they lived, I lived opposite. And one of the guys in the band says, you guys need to get a Bible. And I said, well, where do you get one of those? He says, you go to the Bible bookstore. I said, we're Catholic. I don't know where to get that. So that I looked up in the Yellow Pages and found out where to get it. And so I went to the Mayfair Shopping Center. When I walked out with my King James Bible, I was a three-quarter Protestant. I had to do one more thing. I had to talk to a priest. And so we were always afraid of the priest. I mean, do you remember that? I mean, you former Catholics. And so I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to, go to the rectory, so I said I'll go to confession. So that Saturday at 6 o'clock, Our Lady of Good Hope Church, I pulled in the confession booth. I picked the easiest priest because this was going to be a tough one. So I said, Father, I'm not here to give you my normal confession. I want to let you know what happened to me last weekend. I had a born-again experience. I accepted Christ as my Savior, committed my life to Him. I got baptized, and I just want to let you know I'm leaving the Catholic Church. So there was a conversation that ensued. I don't have time to get into it. So when I walked, so it was the first time ever as a Catholic, I was able to walk out of that church without doing penance. I didn't have to do any Our Fathers or Hail Marys, right? Remember that? Yeah. So when I set foot outside that door and the door closed, I became 100% Protestant, and I've never been back since. And so it was quite the conversation of Italian relatives that, it was an issue, for a long time. So my journey was out of Rome. This is why the Reformation has some deep personal meaning to me, because I had my own personal Reformation. So I love the study of it. And my journey from Rome ended up in Switzerland, but it wasn't the Swiss Autobahn. It was a little like this. So somewhere in this, I had a need. I had to have an identity. Who am I in the faith? Where did I come from? Who are my ancestors? And so, I needed something more than Billy Graham's 1949 Los Angeles crusade, right? I needed something further back. So I ended up studying Reform, went Reform, and then I, of course, needed theology, and so I ended up in Switzerland. So that's a little my story there. So the Reformation has some really personal meaning to me. Okay, so that's Switzerland. These are the flags. Obviously, you see the Christian cross there. Hang on one second. My favorites are Bern up there at the very top, and I like the Geneva one, which is the old bishop's key and insignia there. They're unique flags throughout Switzerland. Okay. So the study today is Ulrich Zwingli. There's two famous pictures of him there. Okay. So we're going to go into Zwingli's birth and his. So this is Wild House. This is we're up in Toggenburg, up in the Alps. It's like 3,600 feet above sea level. So this is, and I've been there, and I'll show you pictures of his house in a minute. So this is the area that Zwingli was born in. He was born 2 weeks after Luther in 1484 on January 1st. His father and grandfather were both mayors of Wild House. The father was a shepherd. He had 11 children, 5 older boys, I think, that went into the farming, shepherding business. They raised cattle. And the 2 other younger brothers became priests. So, and then, I don't know, the sisters, he had 3 sisters. So what's interesting here is that, let me show you his house. So that's the house. It's really about, I think it's 1,200, it's about 800 years old. The Zwinglis didn't own it at first. There's pictures inside that I'll show you. So the house is still there. So this is the interior of the house, the pictures I took. And it's just like, here's what I got when I was there. You get a picture of who Ulrich Zwingli is because of his geography and his surroundings. And the ruggedness of the terrain, up there in the Alps. I mean, I was there in July of '04 and caught a cold because it got down to like 43. I wasn't properly dressed. So you get his surroundings shaped who he was. His home birth, the severity of the winters, all of it shaped who Zwingli was. He wasn't born in the markets of Vienna between two cafes. He was born here. So there's just a ruggedness of his character that comes out of here, comes out of where his upbringing was. So the biographers would write that his character was heroic and he had a commanding influence. Okay, here's what's interesting about Zwingli is that in somewhere between 5 and 6 years old, he's the middle child. He was Ulrich Jr. The dad was obviously senior. His uncle, who was a priest in Wiesen, which is 12 miles down the road, and I've been there, they saw something different in Ulrich. And I don't know if it was a propensity to faith. I don't know if it was, an intelligence factor or whatever it is, a desire to learn. But they took him out of the home at 5 and 6 years old and sent him to his uncle in Wiesen. We're going to go through his early education. And he never returned home for any length of time. He was always he would just do short visits. And it was almost like what Hannah did to Samuel when Hannah dropped Samuel off at temple. I mean, and then we had the great leader in Israel from that. So, all right. So, and Zwingli always talked about his peasant upbringing. And I would say some of the biographers said he really wasn't a peasant because the parents afforded schooling because he spent a good 18 more years in schooling. So you can't really call it his peasant upbringing. When Luther met him in 1529 at Marburg, what did Luther say about his dialect? He said he spoke a shaggy, tangled German, which makes you sweat before you can understand it. Nobody can do a put down better than Luther, right? Okay. So that's his early beginnings. So let's go into. Okay, this is Wiesen. This is where his uncle was, Bartholomew, and he was a priest. So we're going to go through a little bit of his education, which is important because it plays a role in his decision later on in his life. So he was there for 4 years. Then he was sent to Basel, and this is at St. Theodore's. He studied under the great Gregory Bunzeli. And then this was a couple years, and after Bunzeli was done, he sent him back home. The parents then sent him to Bern. This is the great, anybody been to Bern? Yeah? Yeah. I love Bern. It's an old historic city. And then so on the obviously you see the Minster right there that dominates it. You don't want to swim in that river because you'll never come out. It's very fast flowing. And the far left up there is where the government buildings would be. And then we'll show you pictures on that later. So he learned under the great Henry Wolflin literature and classical antiquity. Then the interesting note there, when he was in Bern, the Benedictine monastery wanted him to become a monk, and the parents said absolutely no, which was a great move. Then Zwingli went to University they went to Vienna, and he met some great people. He met Vadian, which we'll talk about later, and he sat under some great Austrian scholars. Then after that, his second visit was to Basel again at Saint Martin's School and Church. So this is the key part in Zwingli's life. So this was the era of the Middle Ages, the close of the Middle Ages. So what you have here is the Roman Catholic Church had exhausted itself with corruption of the clergy and invented religious practices, and something had to change. You had the choice between Renaissance or Reformation. Two choices. And this was going to be two choices in Zwingli's life. So the Middle Ages is about to close. So the Renaissance is what, it's a French word we called the rebirth. And Walter, that I read, Kohler, came up with a really good quote. He said, Renaissance was the teaching of humanism back in the 16th century. And he said, quote, humanists know morality and substance, but miss the power behind it. They miss God, right? So this is the era that Zwingli was taught and lived in. So here we have Erasmus, who was actually a friend, and Erasmus mentored Zwingli, which is really important. So Erasmus, this is his house there, you see, and that's I was there. There's a rare bookstore in his house, which is appropriate for Erasmus. So let's talk about Erasmus a little. So he was a scholar of his day. The courts of kings and queens and dignitaries and scholars alike wanted Erasmus to come and to give them his knowledge. Otto Scott says when Erasmus went to England, he took his barber with him. I mean, that's how famous he was. I don't know, anybody take your barber with you when you go on a trip? I usually don't. So this was how famous he was. So Zwingli met him in 1515 in Basel, and Erasmus told Zwingli, set him against Roman scholasticism and encouraged him to study the Scripture. And Erasmus was kind of a pre-reformer. He critiqued the Catholic Church a lot, the abuses of the clergy and all of that. And then he encouraged Zwingli to study the Bible. But Erasmus was kind of in between the Catholic and the Protestant Church. He was more Catholic because he was a priest. He ended up, within Zwingli being out of favor with Erasmus, it was, I think, 1520, because Zwingli went too far with the Reformation. Okay. And then the great thing about Erasmus is that he gave us the Textus Receptus, where a lot of the new translations in the New Testament came out of. So he was an important figure. He's a pre-reformer. Okay, now, here's the key point in Zwingli's life. And this is where, the last year he was at St. Martin's in Basel, he was there 4 years. He got his bachelor's degree, and he got his Bachelor's of Arts degree. And he met the great Thomas Wittenbach. So Wittenbach was skilled in liberal arts, mathematics, knowledge of the Scripture. So Wittenbach taught Zwingli Peter Lombard's sentences, which is Christian theology, Aquinas, New Testament, and Romans. So he became the greatest influence in Zwingli's life. Here's what Zwingli said about Wittenbach. He said he called him his master and beloved faithful teacher, the most tolerant, learned of all men, and he had frequent correspondence with Wittenbach, and he called him his dear preceptor and brother in Christ. All right, so there's three things in class that Wittenbach taught Zwingli that Zwingli took with him and talked about. And Wittenbach, he said this: the hour is not too far distant in which scholastic theology will be set aside and the old doctrines of the church revived. So, do you get that? He was predicting a reformation or renewal to come. Did he know that the great reformer of Switzerland was in his class? Did Zwingli know that he was going to be the agent to fulfill Wittenbach's prophecy? No. Wittenbach also said this in class, that Zwingli and all the reformers talked often when they tried to reform the Catholic Church. Quote, the death of Christ alone is the price of the forgiveness of sins. So I bring out Erasmus and Wittenbach to show you that Zwingli had a turning point in his life. Somewhere in this next 10-year period of time, what route was he going to go? Was he going to go the route of his mentor Erasmus and be a scholar and have all the benefits of what that life would be? Or would he follow Wittenbach and devote himself into the church and possibly be a reformer? So he took the latter route, which benefited all of Switzerland and to us today. The next 10 years of his life was a quiet time. He was in Glarus. When I was in Glarus in 2004, I couldn't find the old section. I found out in 1860 it had burnt down. So these are somewhat newer churches. He spent 10 years there. He's devoted himself to the Greek and Hebrew, studied the Scriptures, memorized the epistles of Paul, became an ardent student of the Bible. That gave him a foundation for preaching the Reformation to come that came in Zurich. And he was at the Battle of Mongiango in Italy. The Swiss were always mercenaries. To this day they guard the Pope, right? And the Catholic regions of Switzerland. And he witnessed 7 to 10,000 Swiss soldiers dying at this battle in Italy. And he really preached against the mercenary service. But he ended up being kind of booted out of Glarus because of the massive amount of money that came in through the mercenary service into Switzerland. It was one of the biggest sources of income. So you don't want to mess with people's money, right? All right. So he was 10 years there, and this was when he made the decision to devote himself into the church. Then his next call was in Einsiedeln, and this is the monastery just 12 miles south of Zurich. This is the Black Madonna. It was in the news lately. This is a Catholic shrine that so-called had healing virtues. So they would, to this day, there's 800,000 people a year that visit Einsiedeln. And then in Zwingli's day, it was like 150,000. And so what the unique thing about here was that Zwingli would preach. So the Zurichers would come 20, 50 miles south of Zurich to go to the monastery here. They would hear Zwingli preach. So this was the time Zwingli was starting to preach the gospel. So this was 1516. And this mirrored Luther preaching the same gospel unbeknownst to each other at the old wooden chapel, which got destroyed in downtown Wittenberg. So they both got the same message. This is the work of the Holy Spirit, obviously, and unbeknownst to each other. So the unique thing about him and Einsiedeln is that he developed a reputation for a great preacher from the people of Zurich. So there came a time where they needed to fill the vacancy at the pulpit at the Great Minster in Zurich, and Zwingli got the call. So let's go there. Okay, anybody been to Zurich? Been to Zurich? Oh, yeah. Probably my favorite city. Just beautiful. So the big church on the left is the Grossmünster, the Great Minster. Then there's the Frohminster and St. Peter's where Leo Yude preached. So the left bank is somewhat the old city. The right one is like all the banks, Swiss Credit, Bank of Switzerland, all that. If you need $3,000 Canelli suits and Rolexes, you go to this bank, not the other one. You know, it's interesting in Zurich. I didn't know it at the time, but Lenin was holed up there in 1916. I think 45 Spiegelgasse, and then Solzhenitsyn was in exile there for a few years before he moved to Sweden and then Vermont. So beautiful city. So here, this is interesting. Zwingli arrived there on December 25th, 2 days after Christmas, 1518. So on January 1st, his 35th birthday, on 1519, the people of Zurich wanted him to take the pulpit prior to Sunday morning services because of his renown and his great preaching. So he took the pulpit on January 1st in the evening service. And it was kind of an introductory service for him to the people. And he said this in this preaching: "It is to Christ that I desire to lead you, the Zurichers, and to Christ, the source of salvation." So you see Wittenbach in this. You see his teacher, even in that comment. So he started the next day, doing a sermon series on Matthew, because these are Catholics. They'd never really studied the Bible. So he did exposition study on Matthew. Afterwards, the town people, I think Philip Schaff says, "We've never heard anything like this before." Very impressed with Zwingli. He was a model pastor. In 1521, he almost died from the plague, and because he never left. He often met and preached to peasants in the market. He wrote his 67 articles, which became a little more famous later, and those are basic statements dealing with the errors of the Roman Church and gospel truths. So he was starting to make inroads into Zurich and into the religious life. So here's the Great Minster. It's the biggest church. The one I have on the Zurich publishing card is the original church on the far right. Those towers burnt 1860 or whatever. And then that's obviously the inside of the church. That is not Zwingli's original pulpit there. And that's the most important church in Zurich. So this is Zwingli's first home. We're right around the corner from the church, just walking distance. Here's his second home. And I took those pictures in there. And that was around the other corner, very close to the Grossmünster. Okay, this is very important. This is the first Zurich disputation. The way the Swiss would turn their religion from Roman Catholic to Protestant Reform was through disputations. It was basically a debate. So somewhere in November of 1522, Zwingli asked the magistrates, "Can I have a public debate with the Roman bishops concerning what I'm preaching?" So the magistrates agreed. And so they invited Faber, the Bishop of Constance there, that spoke for the Catholic side. He had 3 dignitaries. And then Zwingli was there. Sebastian Meyer from Bern came. Vadian, who he met at Vienna, was there. And then Hofmeister from Schaffenhausen was there. So Zwingli presented his 67 theses there. And so all of these disputations, there was another one in Bern, there was one in Lausanne. The Reformed always would win because the Catholics had the church fathers and they had tradition, and our side had the Bible, had the authority of the Word of God, and it was convincing to the magistrates. And they always would win the debates and the disputations. 2 interesting things that happened here. Well, there was 600 attendees. Obviously, all the ministers from town were there. The council was there. You have to understand, the religion in Switzerland, and really throughout even Germany, was determined by the magistrates, not the ministers, not the reformers. The magistrates controlled the church. This is why the Protestant Reformation was often called the Magisterial Reformation. And these were Christian magistrates. You know, Luther had his, Zwingli had his. And they were very for and supported Zwingli. 2 interesting things happened here at this disputation. Faber gets up early and he says, "I think this is important enough. We need to hold this, but this should be held in Cologne or Paris." Zwingli immediately interrupts and says, "No, how about Erfurt or Wittenberg?" And then Faber says, "Well, that's too close to Luther." And then the whole crowd erupted in laughter. The reformers won that, convinced the town council, which was critical to the religion. Then they had 2 more disputations, smaller in October of that year and then one in the following year. So he went through a series of all kinds of reforms. They closed the nunneries. They turned them and the monasteries into hospitals and orphanages. There was no mention of the saints. Purgatory was eliminated. So this was over a period of time, 3 or 4 years. You know, Christians, we're not in the revolutionary business. So a lot of times you change the religion. It takes the magistrates have got to accept it. The people have got to accept it. It's not an easy thing to do. That's why his Reformation in Zurich was so important. So all these Catholic traditions were swept aside in 3 or 4 years. Eventually, the Mass was outlawed. The key parts of Switzerland is when the Mass was outlawed. That means they became Protestants. So then let me fast forward to something here. This is an interesting event. So this is Christopher Froschauer. He and his nephew were the great printers of Zwingli and Bullinger in Zurich. So there was a time right in Lent in 1522, the first day of Lent, Froschauer's men were working hard to put some books together on Romans, I think, for a book fair coming up. They were exhausted. Froschauer sends his wife to the market to get some meat for the men. So they sat and ate sausages. And this was illegal because it was the first day of Lent. Remember, as a Catholic, we couldn't eat meat? Well, not only Friday, but during Lent, the first day of Lent. It was on the law books. So then it got around town that Froschauer was eating and his men were eating sausages on the first day of Lent. And Zwingli did not eat. So the authorities came and locked Froschauer up and his men for 2 days. And then the Bishop of Constance found out about it, sent 3 priests in for a delegation to investigate what is eating the sausages. So then Zwingli made hay with it. The next Sunday, I believe, he preached against unbiblical fasting. And he made use of this. And then he wrote a treatise called On Meats. And but you have to forgive me for this next photo here. But so that's probably, see the flags? That's probably what they ate. Now I have to do a little Milwaukee plug here. In a German community, if you don't have beer and bratwurst and sausages, the town would fold up. I mean, they'd all move out of town, right? So we have sausage races, down the left field line. That was before you guys all did Mr. Freeze there in the Braves games. So this is the only, you can only in a German community can the eating of sausages be used to promote a religious movement. And that's what we have in Zurich. So, all right. Oh, man, all right, this is Bern. This is real critical. This is the most important city in Switzerland. It's the capital today. At that time, it had the biggest population in the army, which was key. So I don't know if that's the Minster, which is an overwhelmingly beautiful building. And you can see it coming in across the bridge. It's like a New York skyscraper when you come in. The government buildings are up in the far left, and you can't hardly tell what they are. Now, so in 1527, Berchtold Haller, the reformer of Bern, writes Zwingli and says the elections have changed and the magistrates are more favorable for the reform. Then he writes Zwingli again and says, we have the wolf by the ear, but we have not taken him down yet. Who was the wolf? Was the Pope and the clerics. So he's hinting to Zwingli, will you come please and help us take him down? So the magistrates at the end of 1522 declared a disputation. And so the Catholic bishops were invited in. This was in January. And then the reformers had a huge amount of reformers. Haller and Kolb and Haller and Kolb and Meyer were there from Bern. And then the guys from Zurich came in. Ecklampadius came in from Basel. All right, so this was interesting because Haller put 10 theses together of basic Christian doctrine to be used at the disputation. And then Zwingli only spoke twice, which was really a good move because he put the emphasis on the debate with the local guys, with Haller and Kolb. So they carried the debate off of the 10 theses of doctrine. And so Zwingli, near the end, he preached. And this is very interesting, what actually happened. So this is at the Church of the Franciscans. So you see Zwingli in the pulpit there. And then next to the altar, there's a Catholic priest who was converted to the Protestant cause in the middle of the disputation. And the priest takes his vestment and throws it on the altar. You see all the people looking at the priest interrupting Zwingli's sermon? And then what did the priest say? Hang on, I have it here. Well, he said this, I will not celebrate the Mass again either today or ever again. So at the end of this, the Catholic clergy voted 200 to 40 to abolish the Mass. And the Bern Council at the end of January forbade the Mass. They went into the Great Minster and took down 25 altars. Again, the reformers couldn't do this. It had to be legally through the magistrates, right? So they took all the altars down, and they did massive reforms. And the reason they did these quickly is because Zwingli already did it in Zurich. So they saw that. So they just immediately made major moves, and soon they abolished the Mass. This was really a key city. Okay, Bern, let's go to... Okay, Basel, this is where Ecklampadius was. See the church on the right? That's the Basel Minster. You can see it on the left with the Ferris wheel there. That's on the Rhine River. So anyways, in 1529, without a disputation, because of Zurich and Basel, Zurich and Bern, Basel declared for the Reformation. Okay, so this is 1529. So this is... Philip of Hesse, which is southern Germany, knew about the issues between the Lutherans and the Swiss, right? And the issues was over the presence of Christ at the Lord's Supper. And he called the disputation, he called a colloquy at his castle in Marburg. So Zwingli came down the Rhine and picked up Ecklampadius in Basel. Then he picked up Hedio and, let me see if they're here. Yeah, and he picked up Butzer in... that is in Strasbourg. So they were on the Swiss side, and then this was Luther, Melanchthon, Jonas, Agricola, Osiander, and Brentz, all from Wittenberg came. And they were there. And then they met here in this hall, the Knights Hall. And I'll just have to summarize this because we're running out of time. So what Philip of Hesse did, in a genius move, he knew he put Zwingli and Luther together, they would be butting heads. So the first day he put Luther with Ecolampadius, the softer Ecolampadius out of Basel. Then he put Zwingli with Melanchthon, just to keep down on the debates and the issues. And what is this? I think Zwingli met with Melanchthon for like 6 hours, and Luther and Ecolampadius for like 3 or 4. So here's the Ecolampadius during the Marburg. Martin, when Jesus said, "This is my body," it doesn't mean the elements turn into his body. The language is figurative. He also said, "I'm the vine and I'm the rock." He's not a vine and he's not a rock. Luther, no. He's being German. He can't help himself. He's being German. So here's the debate in the second day. See Luther pointing? He writes on the velvet tablecloth, "This is my body." We don't have time to get into the difference between the Reformed and Lutheran position on the Lord's Supper. So one of the biographers said, the second day, you see the magistrates over there on the left? Those are a lot of the electors from Germany. And they were there, obviously, the last 2 days. And this did not end up well. And with the debates, one of the biographers said that the debates were mercifully interrupted by meals and sleep. And so Philip of Hesse is having a heart attack. His dream of this unity between the Lutherans and the Reformed just blowing apart, and he knows what this means. Zwingli breaks down crying. He sees Luther's obstinance. There's quotes in here on Luther. You can't believe what he said. He said basically Zwingli's from the devil. There's not a single point of his doctrine that's accurate. I mean, it was just horrible. So Philip says in desperation, we've got to write some articles of agreement so we can leave this publicly and have some kind of alliance. So who is going to write it? Well, if Zwingli wrote it, Luther would disagree with everything Zwingli wrote. So all eyes looked to Luther, and Luther wrote the 15 articles. 14 the Zerkers just signed off on. It was perfect. I mean, Luther was a theologian. And then the 15th one was the Lord's Supper. And after Luther's obstinance through the whole thing, if you read they're called the Marburg Articles. If you read it, the 15th one is excellent. Luther basically says this is we can't agree on this, so we agree to disagree, and maybe some of those coming after us could figure this out. Basically, I paraphrase it. So they left. Luther refused to shake Zwingli's hand, and he said, "You're not even a brother." You read Luther and you think, could you just behave like a Christian just a couple times in your life? But yet, don't we love Luther? I mean, I got Luther pictures all over my house. Here's what happened years later after after Zwingli died, and I think even after Luther died, Melanchthon says this. He gets a tract from Bullinger, who took over the church from Zwingli in 1531 when Zwingli died. And Melanchthon says, "I finally understand the Swiss position, and I will never again speak against them." Calvin says, "None of us can have a full understanding of this mystery, because it's by faith," meaning the Lord's Supper, what actually happens. This is interesting. So Luther, later in his life, is at a bookstore, at the bookseller in Wittenberg. And the bookseller says, "Hey, this just came in. It's Calvin's tract on the Lord's Supper." And so Luther sits down and reads it. After he's reading, he says to the bookseller, if Calvin was here, we might not have had the issue. Because Calvin and Bullinger later redefined, the Lord's Supper. And in a better way. But Zwingli gave us the basic element of the Lord's Supper, that it's commemorative and it's symbolic. Christ is not in the elements. It's a symbolism, right? Which is what we hold to this day. Okay. Zwingli's death in 1531. I don't have time to get into that. Maybe some other time we could do it. All right, let me end with this. Was Zwingli a great theologian? Was he a theologian? Yes. Was he a great one? No. And that's because he wasn't called to be one. I wrote this. I said, both he and Luther were God's divine bulldozers sent to break up the fallow ground of the Roman errors and mysticism, so a second generation of reformers could come and plant a more defined theology of the Christian religion. Do you see that? That's Bullinger and that's Calvin, right? Calvin and Bullinger could not do what Luther and Zwingli did. So sometimes I think, especially in our Reform realm, we have the theologians up here. The founders, as we found out in class, we don't even know who they are. And then below the founders are the evangelists. And that's where the gentleman gets a 5-star because he remembered William Farel. There would be no Calvin in Geneva without Farel, and there would be none without the work of the founders in Zwingli, hollowing up the ground there for the theologians to come later. So, all right, my last is, what do you got, a minute? Oh, so many good things here. Okay, let me go to the, where's my end here? Okay, my conclusion. Rillier, who wrote a book on Zwingli, says he's the least known of the reformers. And I'll end with this. Here's Samuel Macaulay Jackson, his 1896 book on Zwingli. Here's what he says. Quote, today he is, even in Switzerland, a faint memory, and thousands of Protestants outside of Switzerland do not even know his name. The attention he received from the students is comparatively small. The explanation of this neglect lies at hand. 5 years after Zwingli died, there began at Geneva a memorable career of John Calvin. To him, to Calvin, and not Zwingli, the Reformed Church now looks in reverence. From him, Calvin, and not from the earlier founder, that the church now dates its existence. So you see what Macaulay's saying? Macaulay's saying the Reformed Church was started on Saturday evening, January 1st, 1519, when Zwingli took the pulpit at the Gross Munster. Not August 5th, 1536, 17 and a half years later, when Calvin arrived at Geneva. Final thought. I think I got 30 seconds. All right. So this is my thought for the class. My final thought is, let us bring Ulrich Zwingli back to life, back to the Protestant history, and specifically to the Reformed Church, and give him the place of honor he deserves.